Welcome you all to this masterclass. My name is Bjørn Enge Bertelsen, and I am the academic director of the Holberg Prize. The masterclass is an event where we work to create a space for exchange and dialogue between the Holberg Prize Laureate and PhD students from all the Nordic countries. We also would like to involve the audience in this exchange, and you will all have an opportunity to chip in later on. Today we have with us the 2022 Holberg Laureate Sheila Jasanoff. Sheila Jasanoff is Forsheimer Professor of Science and Technology Studies at the John F. Kennedy School of Government, Harvard University. As one of the world's most influential scholars in developing the field of Science and Technology Studies, STS, Jasanoff has forged a unique, interdisciplinary body of research at the intersection of social sciences, humanities, arts for people and economy, and STEM disciplines. Jasanoff has developed much of the conceptual repertoire for theorizing the political and policy relations of science and technology in contemporary societies. Her theoretical contributions to the political sociology of scientific governance are transformational, recognizing that scientific practices and knowledges, along with the policy and legal frameworks governing them, must be understood as culturally situated and socially constructed. This topic of particular interest for us here today is captured in her collected essays, Science and Public Reason, which was published in 2012. In recommending Jasanoff for the Holberg Prize, the Holberg Committee notes that Jasanoff is a significant public intellectual who offers timely comments on topics of public concern, such as fake news and climate change. Crucially, Jasanoff combines a high level of conceptual clarity with empirical rigor and accessible writing. Indeed, Jasanoff is read not only by humanities and social science scholars, but also by natural and medical scientists and policymakers. Her work is therefore truly wide-ranging and cross-disciplinary. Today, Sheila Jasanoff is joined on stage by 5 PhD students, and these are Ritma Kreye Engelbrett Larsen, yes, who works in the field of history of ideas at Aarhus University in Denmark. Larsen's PhD project investigates how climate and nature imaginaries have changed within and beyond the UN. She also looks at how the local and global scales of climate knowledge are renegotiated as we see an increased inclusion of indigenous knowledge holders. We are also joined by Tanja Riikinen, again the wrong side, from the discipline of history from the University of Oulu in Finland. Her ongoing PhD project investigates socio-technical imaginaries and oil in Finland from the late 1940s to the early 1970s. She combines approaches from history, science and technology studies, and energy humanities. We also have with us Emil Flatø, who's from the science and technology studies field at the University of Oslo in Norway. His PhD project concerns how a future subject to human-induced change became the domain of climate modeling in post-war United States of America, entangling scientific epistemologies with inchoate practices of risk management. Originally from Iceland, Hrefna Gunnarsdottir from the field of law at the University of Copenhagen also joins us. Gunnarsdottir's research interests include health justice, human dignity, health data governance, scientific uncertainties, and research response in health emergencies. In her PhD project, she explores transparent use of clinically collected health data from a patient rights perspective. Our last participant is Hana Marketic, working in the field of library and information science at the University of Borås in Sweden. In her PhD project, Marketic studies the emerging domain of data feminism and the intellectual work of feminist scholars. In particular, she's focusing on socio-technical imaginaries to reconceptualize feminist studies of data and related phenomena. I think we should give all our 6 participants a round of applause. And I also have to say, I apologize for standing in front of them. The stage was too small, so this is why. Now, this is an event that is in large parts in the hands of the Holberg Laureate, as well as the invited PhD students. What will happen now is this. Holberg Prize Laureate Sheila Jasanoff will first provide us all with an introduction to the theme she has chosen for this masterclass. The theme is no less than technology and the human future. Thereafter, the PhD students will provide a short introduction to their research project before we open up a more general discussion on the theme. This will be led by Professor Jasanoff. Towards the end of the masterclass, we will open the floor for a more general Q&A session, and I will moderate this final part of this event. With this, I would now like to give the floor to Sheila Jasanoff, and we should give her a round of applause.
Thank you, Björn, for that splendid introduction, and thanks to everybody connected with the Holberg Prize for giving us collectively the opportunity to think with you and talk with you today. It's interesting to observe in the first place how the human future is always connected to human pasts in different ways. Before the program began, we were talking about how the sort of media center has come to have a certain kind of physical appearance that you sort of recognize, the sort of forms of old architecture like columns interspersed with the guts of buildings peeping through shyly here or there, and you sort of don't know quite where you are. But at the same time, one could see this masterclass as a continuation of a certain kind of medieval wandering scholar mode where people would come from all over to study with somebody. The somebody usually stayed put, but I suppose it's a sign of our contemporary times that in this case, the somebody being me is also traveling. And I think that in that sense, I would hope for this masterclass to include a certain amount of role reversal, because I don't really need to instruct these 5 distinguished young scholars about what this topic is about. They found me in a way before I found them, so they should be doing the introductions and not me. But for the rest of the audience, let me say a few words about the theme. Technology and the human future, first of all. I don't usually cannibalize my own work, but in this case it is the subtitle of the last but one book that I wrote. The front part of it is called Ethics of Invention. And maybe it's worth our thinking together for a minute on how that book even came into being, because it's a sort of interesting history. I was approached by somebody from a trade publisher, and usually I have only published with academic presses, and they said that they were commissioning a series of works that had been asked for by Amnesty International. I'm sure everybody in this group knows Amnesty International. That human rights organization was coming up to its 50th anniversary, and they wanted to redefine what the project of Amnesty International should be, because with the end of the Cold War, there was less to do with, they thought, with fighting for the liberties of particular scientists. Little did they know what 2022 would bring, but nevertheless, they wanted a series of books that would help redefine the topic of human rights and thereby reset Amnesty's own charter going forward into this field. And they had thought about obvious books like one on climate. Everybody's doing something on climate, and several of my young colleagues here today are working on climate as well. But apparently it was the Amnesty people who suggested to the publisher that there should be a book on technology. And the publisher's reaction was, what does that have to do with human rights? So that reminded me way back when, maybe 20 years back, when I was writing a book on science and the law, And I met a young political scientist colleague, and he said, what does science have to do with law? So it seems that this rediscovery that the science and technology are places for law, places for politics, places for normative thinking, that really needs to be done explicitly for a lot of people. Because why is it that over now, a several decade-long trajectory, I keep running into people who seem to think, who seem to ask that question, what does this have to do with human rights, with normativity, with law, with politics? I mean, isn't technology just technology? Isn't a table a table? And, that's all it is, a table. So, of course, it's not that. And as I think you will be hearing in 5 different voices and from different universities, different intellectual traditions, many people who look at technology closely are discovering that technology is one of the most profound ordering forces in modern society. Technological choices affect how we live, what we do, how we order ourselves in all kinds of ways. One could write, if one were a cultural theorist by predilection, a little on-the-spot essay about how you all are grouped here because of the ways the table and chairs are designed, and even the lighting system and the sound system, and not everything that we end up doing. Like right now, I'm supposed to be talking to you in a spontaneous pedagogical mode, but the spontaneity is a little bit curtailed by being told where I have to sit, where I have to look, how my voice should sound, what I should do to conceal the wiring. I mean, we're all, in that sense, cyborgs in the world, right? I mean, so technological systems offer us all kinds of possibilities, the wonderful possibility of gathering together from so many different places and sort of places of our lives, but also constrains us in different ways. So if you are a lawyer by training, as I am, and a constitutionalist by predilection, as I am, you learn that constitutions, in the most general sense, are devices in law that both enable and constrain. But if technology also both enables and constrains, then de facto you could start thinking of the technological systems in our lives as having constitutional dimensions, in a sense. But constitutions do a lot for us. They enable in particular ways. They enable us to understand our relationship to power in a certain way. They enable us to understand our rights, our duties, our obligations, but also the correlative rights, duties, and obligations of those in power in relation to us. Constitutions set out for societies the social compact. It doesn't matter whether those constitutions are written or unwritten. This past weekend, for the Anglophiles among you, you saw aspects of British constitutional order, which famously is an unwritten one, being enacted in front of our eyes, and it was full of tradition amidst the unwritten. I mean, so many things are, in that sense, invisibly written. Technology is like that. You could think of the British monarchy as a technology of power. And then you could think of its intersections with the material technologies that then allow voices to carry and people to be envisioned and so on and so forth. So if technology is in effect a kind of abstract domain of constitutional power, the exercise of constitutional power, one can start thinking about its implications, both past and future, intersecting somewhere in this time that we call the present. The present is really every bit as mysterious as language is. The moment you've sort of said the word present, it's gone, it's the past, right? I mean, it's a very weird thing, the present. So in a way, collapsing past and future is an intellectually challenging and interesting thing to do. And several of our speakers have already said that they are trained in history. But it's partly how that historical understanding helps us in contemplating the challenges of the future. That is something that technology mediates in various senses. So technology holds certain things constant just by virtue of the materiality of it. But in science and technology studies, we've long since learned that the stability that technology confers is only partial. So there is an entire stream of writing in the field of technology studies that recovers agency, in a sense, that shows how, even though technologies are designed in certain ways, people can use them in ways that, in a way, transcend the imagination of the people who originally conceived of it. Now, that transcendence can just be redesigned. So if you Google light bulb, you can find, a progression of light bulbs sort of similar to that well-known cartoon of the rise of the human from the ape figure. So you can see the Edisonian light bulb becoming the LED lighting of the present and whatever. So technological design itself has a futuristic dimension because you can imagine it evolving. But how we live with technology, how we order ourselves in relation to the normative power of technology, that part is not circumscribed by what is material. That part is in our imaginations, in our commitments, our normative commitments as to how we wish to live with one another. What responsibilities do we owe to one another? Now, you will hear the word climate coming up numerous times. It already has in Björn's introduction of our speakers. It is an exemplary space today for testing out many of these propositions. So climate change is a field that is shot through with technology on many levels. It came about because we humans decided to do technological things. For instance, extract petroleum, and there is one speaker who will be talking about petro futures in Finland and understandings about that. But equally, the climate has now begun to embrace questions of what should the technological solutions of the future look like. Are we going to manage solar radiation, or are we going to manage human consumption, or are we going to take the carbon that is already in the air and find ways of putting it back underground? I mean, these are all vast technological projects that are being thought about. The entire, what will the hydrogen economy look like, or can we do renewables, and will nuclear power be making a comeback? I mean, these are all technological questions and debates that are very much in the newspapers, in the here and now, but they concern the futures that we're building. The dimension that I hope we will explore with our speakers is the forms of life that are entailed in these technological choices. And the most fundamental one there, I think, that we should think about is a kind of large constitutional change in our world that says we can no longer afford to be, we no longer have a moral right to be citizens of just the places, the localities, the nations, even the regional formations that we are part of. That, in a sense, by being human, humanus sum et nihil humanum alienum a me puto. I cannot think of anything human as being alien to me. We're in that world, we've been thrust into it. Unwillingly, for the most part. I mean, people don't mind making sacrifices for their immediate family. They're less eager to make those sacrifices by paying taxes for their communities. In Scandinavia, you're more used to it than we are in America. But in any case, making sacrifices for the world at large, that is a kind of generosity and charitability of spirit that few people can bring to themselves. So I think that in the talks that will follow, we will hear something about the institutions, the histories, the commitments, and the promises that actually might help us enlarge our imaginations to become citizens of the world that technology has created for us. And with that, let me hand it over to Hana to lead us forward.
Hello. Hey, hello. Nice to see you, everybody. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. I'm very excited to be able to participate in this masterclass. My name is Hana. Again, I am from the Swedish School of Library and Information Sciences in Borås, in Sweden. And I am working on a project that is under a working title, Socio-Technical Imaginaries in Data Feminism. So why is that so? In 2019, I have read a book by Zuboff, Shoshana Zuboff, who wrote about surveillance capitalism. And she describes how data collected about people's actions online led to a new prevailing business model on the internet that is characterized by what she calls extraction imperative to collect as much data about users' actions online as possible. And those data are then used to group users together and to predict their future behavior. And Zuboff finishes her book by calling for reimagining future that would not entail technological surveillance in a capacity that it tends to today. For me, this begs the question, what visions of alternative futures are there? And I became interested in the ways that critical perspectives to data and technology perceive the positive visions of progress in relation to dominant imaginaries. So those influenced by Silicon Valley techno-positivism. In my first study that I have conducted previously, I have done a sort of a literature review of what data feminism is and collected a body of texts from which the concept of big data has emerged as a critical concept. So in the second study that I will be focusing more on today, I am actually comparing those imaginaries about big data emerging from those texts to a previous study done in 2018 about big data imaginaries in policies of the European Commission. So some new fields, as they emerge, become disciplines and more convergent, whereas others organize into a multidisciplinary area. Yet others remain loosely tied and organized under an umbrella concept. And data feminism is one such study. It has been most comprehensively defined to date by D'Ignazio and Klein, who have written a book on data feminism in 2020. But of course, such efforts predate both the book and the concept. And it was defined as a way of thinking about data, both their uses and their limits, that is informed by direct experience, commitment to action, and intersectional feminist thought. And big data appear to be a key concept for articulating visions of futures. In Dreamscapes of Modernity, comparison is said to be a perhaps most indispensable method for studying socio-technical imaginaries, and that comparing across social and political structures helps identify contours and content of socio-technical imaginaries. So in European Commission policies, it has been found that imaginaries are largely economical in character, and metaphors align with big tech rhetoric in them. So it is described as an asset to be exploited. Metaphors are used such as new oil, gold mine, game changer, and even motor and foundation of the future economy. It needs to be said, of course, that in Europe we have significant legislative attempts to regulate security and privacy online through GDPR and DMA and DSA, certain articles of the copyright law. But it has to be noted that metaphors are aligning with big tech rhetoric, and that on the one hand, data is imagined as empowering to the citizens and free, and on the other hand, as a asset that can be exploited to gain economical gain for a union that has been seeing its economical growth slowing down. So in the analyzed text, I find perhaps unsurprisingly that imaginaries of big data and data feminism are somewhat more critical. Big data is talked about as dominance, oppression, and a threat requiring resistance. So it is described as a domination on some instances and as violence on others. Dominance is achieved through data, and freedom is needed from dominance by data in these texts. Parallels are drawn to colonialism and exploitation, and there are overlapping issues in data feminism that are talking about issues of seeking equal representation in big data on the one hand, and on the other hand, about surveillance and privacy. In Dreamscapes of Modernity, we read that technology supports social order, and big data is an archetype of creating of social order through technology top-down. And we can see that in imagining of big data as oppression, for example. I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you for your attention. Handing the word over.
I could probably say, without feeling too awkward about it, that residents in Iceland tend to think highly of their voluntary search and rescue teams, who selflessly share their expertise, their time, their equipment to rescue those in danger. And this narrative has in Iceland been used in support of the use of certain biotechnologies. And I'm going to give you 2 examples. Beginning with the director of a biotech company that's located in Iceland, who has, or had, for almost a decade, urgently called on the Icelandic state to step in and proactively notify individuals that carry a certain variant on their BRCA2 gene that increases the likelihood of breast cancer. He compared the state's responsibilities to that when the state intervenes and evacuates people from their homes in the case of an avalanche. When there was still a larger consensus about collecting consent prior to providing this information, the company went ahead, established its own website, and allowed individuals to directly request this information for themselves, simultaneously strongly suggesting that the state authorities had neglected their responsibilities of saving people's lives. I move on to the second example. We have the same research team stepping in, facing an unknown hazard, in a collaboration with the National University Hospital and the company. The company tested and analyzed thousands of COVID-19 tests per day throughout the pandemic. In the first days in March 2020, they collected patient samples, and in addition to clinically treat the patients, the samples were used for research purposes, trying to figure out this new disease, with the results rapidly published in one of the world's leading medical journals. The government and public officials, they recognized the support that the company gave to the weakest link of Iceland's healthcare infrastructure, which is the lack of virological research capacity. Some referring it to coming to the rescue. Until late last year, the data protection authorities concluded that while this data, the samples and the data stemming from them, were safeguarded securely the whole time, for 3 days in March 2020, the collaboration did not collect consent from the patients about using the data for research purposes. This decision triggered enormous dialogue about the blurred boundaries between the scientific and clinical research, about formalities and fundamental rights and when it's necessary to act quickly, and not the least about lawyers that don't understand scientific research in emergencies. So let me put these 2 examples into the context of today's topic. Firstly, they show us the known narrative of laws that slow down and hinder scientific initiatives. Here illustrated as a rescue operation defining the public good. We see a company taking on a role for agency and responsibility in the absence of what they perceive as a necessary initiative at the governance level or in the established need for support during COVID-19. Intertwined is the reciprocity and social value, providing a resilient receiver, an enlightened citizen with information about their own breast health, or at the community level stepping in, but perceiving the social value of their work undermined or even taken for granted in the eyes of the law, or at least the lawyers, who then again assume, on the contrary, that they are working in line with their professional mandate, identifying hazards in accordance with their expertise. Second to last, we see a certain progress in a certain direction despite opposite views on what's good and desirable. We see different views or even understanding on legal and ethical concepts such as consent and their degree of importance when it comes to emergencies. And we also see maybe, and we're left maybe with this question of when is our need for knowledge, when is our need for rescue great enough that we move along our legal models? Thank you.
Oh, is there sound? Is there sound now? Yes, there is. Hey, I'm Emil. I work on a project about historical temporality, so today I'll be telling a bit of a story about a certain imaginary that is temporal, which is that scientists are to be some kind of custodians of the long term. So in July of 1971, an international group of atmospheric scientists met for 3 weeks, intensive weeks of workshopping at a bucolic convention center on the Stockholm archipelago. On a Nordic night where the sun never seemed to set, an Indian delegate, Pisharot Rama Pisharotti, sat with his German colleague Hermann Flohn on one of the smooth Scandinavian rocks that lead right into the sea. We call them Svaberg in Norwegian. Flohn recognized it as a huge piece of granite smoothed over by glaciers during the last ice age. Pisharotti recited another ancient relic, a 3,000-year Sanskrit daily prayer, which Flohn would remember forever because he found it so dramatically different from the Christian, "Be fruitful and multiply." "O Mother Earth," Pisharotti began, "with the ocean as her garments and the mountains as her breasts, forgive me that I trample upon you." So the report that resulted from this summer study, Inadvertent Climate Modification, as it's called, is often cited as a precursor of the IPCC assessment report. SMIC, as it's known for short, is famous as a watershed uniting prominent Earth scientists in shared concern for climate change. It also included the first call for a kind of integrated modeling of social factors and the Earth system in trying to address that issue. And on its title page, we find this Sanskrit daily prayer printed. Now, the kind of summer camp atmosphere that brought senior academics from different parts of the world together for late-night discussions about the momentousness of anthropogenic change was the result of careful preparations and planning. SMIC was the end result of MIT's first and only ever PhD project in so-called socio-technological engineering, and its title is Development of a Mechanism for Utilizing Science in Global Environmental Policy Formulation. It was written by the main organizer of the summer study, William Matthews, who was working under the supervision of Carol Wilson. The goal was to make the interface between science and policymaking the subject of expertise, design, and engineering, which meant that Matthews and Wilson thought through every major and minor detail of how they will fulfill their goal of providing a knowledge basis for the 1972 Stockholm Conference on the Human Environment. The location had to be beautiful, comfortable, close to an airport, but removed from the distractions of the big city because Wilson had tried to have a conference once in Paris, and it was just a nightmare. Families were invited to sort of relieve the stress of leaving home, that is, wives and children, obviously, because all the professors were men. And after the intensive work days, the discussions were continued over nice dinners and whiskey salons. Wilson welcomed everyone by insisting that they address each other on a first-name basis, which only one professor objected to, so they had to call him Professor. But on the more substantive side, they had clear thoughts about why inadvertent climate modification was singled out from a previous assessment that they did on critical environmental issues. And those were that it was scientifically challenging and sufficiently general, anodyne perhaps, to suit an international forum like Stockholm. They had thoughts on how to learn about political concerns and the needs for knowledge in political institutions, thought on how their work sessions would function, thoughts on who was invited, thoughts on who was not invited, and that's with those who had overstated risks based on the available scientific evidence, and no social scientists because their work was not considered problem-oriented enough. They even had thoughts on publicity, which was that the report had to be published in no less than 90 days. Now, the kind of social technical imaginary that animated this work was the idea that scientists and experts could be custodians of the long term. Experts were considered more attuned to the temporalities of oceans, of mountains, of ancient prayers, of decadal accumulations of industrial emissions than the myopia of politicians and industrialists. MIT itself, some powerful figures there, hoped to create a kind of vanguard lookout institution in a kind of new world order they were envisioning of a complex industrial society in a détente era politics marked by transnational collaboration on so-called critical problems. Now, I just think that, like, compared with the ink that has been spilled on criticizing global climate models, like their globality, their views from nowhere, it is striking how rarely we question the idea that scientific conceptions of the long term have some sort of innate moral and political value. I don't know about that, but I do know that what SMIC shows is that long-term concern for climate change did not emerge from the scientific process itself. At the time, the evidence was shaky, and until very recently, the long-term dream had been harnessing the power to control weather and climate, hence the title, Inadvertent Climate Modification. So a turning point was this experiment in how to entangle scientific and political processes. One eye was to the sky, the other was entrained to those myopic timelines where politics happen. Thank you.
Okay, hello. Hello, everyone. I'm Tanya. First of all, I would like to express my deepest gratitude to the Holberg program for inviting me here. It is a great honor to participate in this masterclass with Professor Sheila Jasanoff, as her work has inspired me for years. Her book, Dreamscapes of Modernity, which she edited together with Sang-Hyun Kim, inspired me so much that I decided to use the theoretical concept of socio-technical imaginaries as the main analytical lens of my doctoral dissertation. What fascinates me most about the concept is that it can reorient our thinking by drawing attention to that intertwined relationship of entities that we human beings call science, technologies, and societies. It provides a unique lens with which to explore the complex and non-deterministic nature of future-making processes, how visions of desirable socio-technical futures have been and are formulated, implemented, challenged, and stabilized across time and space. While talk of desirable futures may lead us to think technological solutions which can come into being in the future, Professor Ulrich Feld has interestingly pointed out that a socio-technical imaginary can also be one in which the refusal to adopt certain technological arrangements is interpreted as a pathway towards a better future. In my ongoing study, I travel back in time to explore the role of socio-technical imaginaries in the energy transition to oil in Finland. The time frame of the study spans from the late 1940s to the early 1970s. I suggest that phenomena such as the switch to oil heating, the increase in petroleum-powered transport, the construction of domestic oil refining industry, and the development of oil spill response systems can be interpreted as manifestations of socio-technical imaginaries articulated by diverse contemporary actors. For example, in parliamentary debates on oil, these technological pathways were presented either directly or indirectly in tandem with ideas about the preferred way of life and the common good. While for some politicians investing in oil technologies appeared as a reasonable solution, Others took a more skeptical approach on the matter and suggested either alternative or supplementary pathways for reaching hoped-for prospects. Using the theoretical lens, it is also possible to shed light on how the socio-material arrangements that existed at the time both enabled and imposed restrictions on the hopes, fears, and choices concerning energy futures. In the big picture, energy scenarios related to oil futures were hardly exceptional. Rather, oil technologies were part of a wider array of technologies on the imagined pathway towards a socio-technical future that was defined by contemporaries as desirable and attainable for a modern, industrialized, prosperous, and secure welfare state. As Chazanov and Kim discussed in one of the articles in the course readings, today energy futures are also envisioned through positive promises. These dreams include the idea that people are able to find technological fixes to the challenges that we see in our environment, which, for their part, uphold and foster a particular way of life. Through the lens of socio-technical imaginaries, it is interesting to consider the scale on which these scenarios are built on human beings' understandings of what kind of socio-technical worlds we have lived in so far, what kind we live in this moment, and what kind we hope to live in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. In the latest IPCC report, released in April of this year, we find no less than 489 mentions of indigenous knowledge. And in most of these instances, the authors vehemently stress the importance of indigenous knowledge in relation to climate mitigation and natural resource management. This would seem to indicate the beginnings of a rupture in our socio-technical imaginaries pertaining to climate and nature. A rupture in the hitherto dominant paradigm, which I will refer to as the vast machine inspired from Paul Edwards. Now let me first explain how the vast machine approaches the world. From recent research within environmental history, it has been pointed out that a global synoptic perspective has arisen in the climate science. In this perspective, the system sciences hold the primary epistemic authority in climate change and on climate change, comprising an expertise for the future. Now, we are here today on the topic of technology and the human future. So I will draw up a development that at this point is somewhat contested and that is clear-cut as it can seem in the short presentation format, with the contours drawn a bit sharply. With these reservations in place, I would like to point out that the significant increase in inclusions of particularly indigenous knowledges indicates a beginning rupture in what I earlier called the global synoptic perspective. This can be illustrated through two key tensions that present themselves as these different knowledge systems are brought together in the IPCC report. The first issue regards the experience of climate change. And why is that? Well, a premise for the so-called vast machine paradigm is that climate change, in the words of Adam Tooze in today's readings, is inaccessible to the naked eye or immediate perception. He furthermore writes that this means for our society that we become radically dependent on specialized scientific knowledge to define what is and what is not dangerous, whereby we lose an essential part of our cognitive sovereignty. Of course, the cognitive sovereignty indigenous peoples have been stripped of for centuries. Now, this global synoptic perspective of climate change stands in contrast to local perspectives, which are accessible through experience. This could be natural environments, sites of pollution, habitat deterioration, and so forth. But the vast machine is premised on a distinction between climate as an invisible atmospheric system and nature as a localizable, visible site on the ground. And this distinction one rarely finds in indigenous knowledge perspectives. They, on the other hand, are premised upon the inseparability of these entities, and importantly, the idea that climate change can actually be experienced. Why is this an issue? Well, it poses some important questions for how we navigate the representation and conceptualization of climate change in the future. Because the current paradigm of climate change invisibility is premised upon the importance of technology as a medium for gaining knowledge, and it uses these instruments, data processors, model systems, because human senses alone cannot obtain the knowledge. You can almost hear it in the name, a vast machine. Under this paradigm, it is hard to find a place for indigenous knowledge. And this is where I would argue the second tension arises, namely in technology. As Jasanoff and others remind us, technology is never autonomous. We need careful analytics that deflate the divinatory status of technological autonomy, at least when it comes to the idea that technology is necessary for gaining knowledge on climate change. It seems as if indigenous knowledge plays exactly this role in the IPCC reports. Again and again, the IPCC authors stress the importance of local and indigenous knowledge collaboration. A few places, it is even invoked in an outright recognition of the limitation of science and technology. That is why we see even established institutions such as the IPCC bringing in indigenous peoples who hold insights and knowledge on local scales, and who also tend to endow agency to entities other than human, but rarely ones of a technological nature. And in contrast to the vast machine, what indigenous knowledge holders oftentimes will bring to the table are exactly perspectives that include a normative dimension. But alas, I digress. And I don't mean to simplify or idealize indigenous knowledge, but I hope I have sketched out the contours of some beginning ruptures in the global synoptic perspective that have shaped climate imaginaries since the 70s. It is certainly no clear rupture as of yet, but it does have the potential to make for a more pluralized notion of expertise and a recognition of the implications for climate and nature imaginaries that various distributions of agency hold, and their historical contingency and cultural embeddedness. This is indeed a testimony to the normative force of technology and science in the world, as Sheila Jasanoff insightfully reminds us, in dreamscapes of modernity. And furthermore, as she also reminds us that imagining the future is political. Thank you.
So thank you for all of these presentations. I guess to get a collective discussion going, it might be interesting to tease out some of the cross-cutting themes. And so you've all stressed agency one way or another, both invisible institutions in the background, like law in your case, that to some degree take away institutions. One could even think of MIT with its technocracy, which you obviously didn't have time to develop, but what was, I mean, these informal conversations where everybody could call each other by their last names, of course, represented, as you implied, a very small tranche of the humanity affected by climate. So I was wondering if you could elaborate on the things you've already said by taking up this question of agency that Ritma just ended on, and say a bit about how the technological systems that you were each looking at configure the possibilities for agency. Because if we're thinking about making futures, it becomes significant to think about who can participate and who is not able to participate in these different constructions of regimes, if you will, that each of you is discussing. We don't have to follow woodenly the same array of, or the same order of speakers, so anybody who wants to pick up first, feel free to do that.
I can go ahead. I think it's interesting within the legal world that we have certain social contracts which are based on deep consensus, we hope, about how we should regulate our future and our world, our current world and our future and diverse. And those are tested now, I would say, to at least. Those are being tested because we have, they're big promises. Let's take precision medicine as an example. There are promises that are announced to people about what we can achieve if we only get more access to data and if we only get, solidarity about sharing this data. And it is testing against a consensus that's been with us for quite a long time about consent. And we still haven't figured this out. And what happens is that I try to draw out in my examples is that when our social contract says we can't go there, there will be push about going there anyway. And we as lawyers, I assume, we have to be creative about how to construct governance systems that navigate between individual rights and also benefit for the community as a whole. And that is a little bit more challenging to do when each expert that you're trying to bring together identifies their own hazard of uttermost importance.
Thank you. I'm interested in the way in which, for you, a lot of the constraining structure comes out of law and legal thinking, and that there is a background of law that both shapes a kind of social contract and within that social contract allows certain kinds of things to be expressed in terms of solidarity or not. I wonder, Hana, how you would respond from your study of data science and feminist data science. You began with Shoshana Zuboff, and in terms of coining little phrases, she has certainly had enormous success with this little phrase, surveillance capitalism. But is there a contractual idea back of that, and if so, what? Are there people who feel empowered in this system of surveillance capitalism? Does feminism bring something to the picture? I mean, how does feminism interact with the rather extractive and depersonalized model of data as opposed to the more sort of solidaristic model of data that to some extent has been put forward as an imaginary in Iceland? I wonder if you have thoughts about any of those dimensions.
Wow, that's a big question for me to answer. I think on the question of agency, it becomes sort of a double-edged sword in a datafied society where agency can sometimes mean empowerment, like you said, on one hand, but also it can form sort of an acceptance of these normative structures and technologies that are constricting in themselves. So that's, I think, what came to my mind when you asked that question. So there are, of course, ways to negotiate the effects of, for example, surveillance. There are examples of studies that have shown different types of, like you yourself in your initial talk have talked about, reconfiguring technologies and working around them or with them to bring more empowerment. And that is, of course, the case in different feminisms as well. But then again, such working with technology very often affirms the exact structures that are often criticized. Then on a different note, I think a very interesting thing has been said for the case of making big data small, and that when focusing on outliers and looking at data from perspectives of, for example, minorities, big data sets very often quickly become small ones. So yeah. Am I missing out any of the aspects of your question?
Well, I mean, I could press you slightly more to see whether you think that the sort of resistance to the machine of big data, in a sense, the feeling of helplessness that people often have, that, you know, the verb datify, which has, you know, come into use only in very recent times, suggests a kind of dehumanizing potential almost, that people are being turned into data in some sense, whether they like it or not. I mean, you're nothing but a collection of pixels and somebody else is putting this all together. So does making big data small, to your mind, produce more opportunities for intervention? How does one make big data small anyway?
That is an interesting question. I think in the example that I have given, it is just a way of representing how big data is very often very homogeneous, and it represents perspectives of a limited group of people or just limited perspectives. There was one other thought that I had that is escaping me now.
Well, I could ask you something that possibly connects through the law in a sense. The GDPR, which has been mentioned, I mean, I think you mentioned it, the data protection regulation, one of the key features of it is this idea of the right to be forgotten, which it comes out of making big data small in a sense. I mean, Mr. Gonzalez was just one person, right, lined up against Google. But the principle is huge, right? I mean, the principle is about, I mean, talk about technology and the human future. It's about who gets to control the memory of you, each of us, and to what extent a company like Google can simply create the technological possibility for infinite storage and thereby turn us all into zombies, in effect. I mean, we can disappear off the face of the earth, but they will retain traces of us. So there's an example of big data being made small, and yet the smallness being made big through the exercise of law. I wonder whether if you turn that into a feminist case, you might say anything further about this. I mean, several of us, maybe all of us here on this stage are feminists. What should we do?
Yeah, I feel a bit uncomfortable putting in a position of the authority on feminism, and I think, like you said, many of us here consider ourselves to be that, but I think that's maybe a question for all of us to answer.
Yes, well, one could say, as a riposte, we should all be humanists, not feminists.
Can I actually add a question on this topic? Because I'm just wondering if we can talk a little bit more about sort of the differences between European imaginaries of big data and surveillance capitalism, which I guess has predominantly sort of Silicon Valley and American roots, right? Because I think, looking from Norway, I very much recognize the story of COVID data management in Iceland. You know, we had a similar thing of, like, they created this app and they wanted to use that for research purposes, and actually that was a large reason why it was a failure, because people didn't want to sign up and consent to being a data object. They just wanted the managerial part of things. And what's so striking in Norway about that institution running that, so it's called the Folkehelseinstituttet, so the public health, like basically kind of the CDC, is that they're now part of this push to collate different registry sources for big data research in several fields. Which I guess derives from the transparency and the well-functioning nature of Norwegian bureaucracies, right? We have so many data sets that can now be collated, and we have the trust, public trust, to be willing to offer them up to the authorities for these kind of new levels of intricacy in terms of what big data sets do. Which reminds me of, you know, the role of genome databases in Iceland, right? So I'm wondering whether the route to commodification of big data is different in Europe because it's run by the state more than commercial companies.
Well, I mean, let me turn the question around against you, although I wanted to talk about indigenous knowledge, but in a sense we're all indigenes and everything is indigenous anyway. I want to question you a little bit on why you're putting a line down the middle of the Atlantic and saying Europe and America, when Europe, as we know, is pretty multiple, and even Norway and Sweden and Denmark have been known to say we're not like each other in these various respects, and the sort of contractual agreements about who the state is and how it operates are not the same. So I wonder whether something particular is in your mind as a differentiation that makes sense between such large entities as the US and Europe, because one sees very many formations.
For sure. I think that the idea of being always very attentive to civic epistemologies is very important, but also to sort of how they aggregate into wider logics, right? And I think that obviously big data discourse in Europe is so organized around the EU and the push towards the GDPR and all of that kinds of thinking. So that does make a bit of a boundary through the Atlantic, even if Iceland and Norway aren't proper members. And it's also a little bit because a lot of these, so the Norwegian Public Health Institution, for instance, early history of funding from the Rockefeller Foundation, a lot of it was very inspired by the successes of post-war science in America, so there's certainly traffic across the Atlantic, but I guess particularly for that reason, I think it's so important to sort of distinguish what logic is actually at play, or how are those wider narratives, such as surveillance capitalism, appropriated in different polities?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's always a salutary reminder, but I think that the deeper point that all three of you are making is something about the need to look at the background institutions that sustain or modify the understandings of different technological possibilities that move around the world. And I think that there's obviously one could write in detail about the nuanced differences even among the Scandinavian countries, but then agree that when contrasted with something like red state Americanism today, there still is a difference between having social democracy as the dominant form of governance and having the market as a different form. And I think that going back to Zubov's analysis, it's interesting that surveillance is coupled to capitalism and not to the state, right? I mean, the worry on this side of the Atlantic, the thing that, for instance, led the Germans for a while to suspend their census altogether was about data gathering, big data, as being an instrument of surveillance, in a sense, by the state. But I want to continue on this theme of agency at least a little bit longer, and Ritma, come back to some of the implicit things you were saying about indigenous knowledge and indigenous formations. So partly one could approach that from the standpoint of the big and the small. I mean, that the category of indigenous, after all, has been a bit of a mobile category, and there didn't used to be an Inuit council that took people from all these different countries, and now one can talk about the Arctic as being a region that has actually mobilized people in that way across multiple countries. Can you say a little bit about what you think about the relationship of technological imaginaries to the possibilities of mobilization? That is, has the imagination of what's possible and what climate means and how we should organize against it, has that changed through the different self-understandings of indigeneity and the different possibilities of social movement making and activism?
Oh, let me try and get to an answer. What I would probably say at first is that I'm from history of ideas, and so I don't speak as an authority on indigenous knowledge per se, but my field as such is also named intellectual history. So what I look at are representations of and ideas of. So indigenous knowledge as a concept, a dynamic concept, and a field that is somehow represented in, for instance, IPCC reports. Nonetheless, I actually struggled a little bit at first to combine the idea and the materiality of technology to indigenous knowledge. And I think that that's also what I sort of tried to incorporate it in my presentation. I think the reason is because indigenous people and indigenous knowledge as ideas do have sort of a peculiar relation to technology. Because on the one hand, it's very important not to be reductive and say that indigenous knowledge is merely traditional knowledge that is from the past and that has no change or dynamism to it. That would be totally wrong. But unfortunately, and especially in such a short format as this, where you cannot make all the proper nuances, there is actually a bit to that very simplified idea. Because what you see when they come in the IPCC report and they bring indigenous peoples to the table in actual meeting rooms, and as different activist groups gain a larger presence within these conversations, oftentimes what they bring is an idea of climate and nature that has, one, other ontological commitments, which in itself brings a very interesting sort of negotiation, but also these ontological commitments are oftentimes a lot closer aligned and not even implicitly but explicitly with a normative dimension. And that is where I think the negotiations sometimes have a hard place. But if I should take these ideas and these observations and sort of direct it more towards a future perspective, what I would probably argue, while being mindful of the vulnerability of being too reductive or simplifying, I think that what I mean by the pluralizing of expertise, is that I think that this contested relationship that indigenous knowledge seems to have to technology, as it also challenges the idea that technology is a necessary medium in all instances for gaining experience on climate and nature, or a necessary medium for gaining the right kind of knowledge. Because if we do want to include indigenous knowledge collaborators, we do have to open up some space where there is an experiential dimension to climate and nature. And this experiential dimension cannot, in this space at least, be dependent upon technology. So what I would say is that, and I know that this sort of makes me put myself in a bit of a curious place within this panel, because I think that the perspective that indigenous knowledge brings is one of, I wouldn't say putting technology aside, that would be wrong. I would more say what they bring to the table is, from the first instance, a deep commitment to the commitment and recognition of the normative dimensions of technology, and maybe it's exactly due to that they have an important voice in our future imaginaries for climate and nature.
So I think that the totality of what you said goes a little further than the very last thing. That is, it's not just the deep normative differences, but you said also ontological presumptions, right? Mm. And I mean, I think that brings us to a kind of problematic in the way that many people use the idea of imaginaries. I mean, they think that it's just a matter of stakeholders with different normative positions, and if you get them all sitting around the table, they will end up agreeing. I'm going to ask Emil and Tanya a question next, but I wonder if we can get back to, some of that theorizing potential and, to some extent, multiple understandings of the term sociotechnical imaginaries itself, since it keeps cropping up in all of your work, and maybe even get to your questions about what you would like to ask. But I was going to turn to Tanya first, but Emil, I'll turn to you first, because your talk most clearly put this point about ontology and normativity on the table with your very eloquently written statement, because you talked about the contrast between be fruitful and multiply, and being on the bosom of the earth and interfering in a sense with nature. I mean, almost a deep ecology type of sensibility that you.
Sorry?
Deep ecology. I mean, that is the normativity
Yeah.
of the ecology itself. But then you didn't, in the 5 minutes, have enough time to really elaborate on what was, after all, a sort of ontological normative package that seemed to be very different in your telling between the Western imaginary, the Judeo-Christian imaginary, and the Hindu tradition. How did they come together around the table if their understandings of how we should live on the earth are so radically different? I mean, it seemed almost like a rhetorical sleight of hand that the poetic sounding thing was put in the preface, and then nobody bothered really to incorporate it into the thinking. But maybe you could say a little bit more about that.
Mm-hmm. I'm not sure that analysis is wrong necessarily, and I think that's really important to notice the ways that certain things carry a sense of can bring up the spiritual, or can bring out the sense that we're transcending a kind of industrial reality that is insufficient or something like that. I very much think that was part of why that quote was included, you know. But I think to the extent that it was trying to reckon with the specifics of that statement, I think it has to do with both the turn towards to wider temporalities, which is part of kind of the rise of complexity science and that stuff, and just also the very clear statement about sort of placing the human within a wider ecological context, right? So forgive me that I trample upon you, the presence of a human being there, because I think a lot of what transpired after this was this turn towards rendering the anthropogenic as a systemic factor, you know, which is what you get with these Earth system models that are like nitrogen cycle and human influence kind of thing. So I think there's an element of appropriation of the sage.
Yeah, well, if you move over to 2000 and the coining of the term Anthropocene, you know, that has been seen as an invitation to just wider and deeper and temporally longer control, and not for humility and walking more lightly on the earth, which are two different ways of imagining things. But Tanya, tell us a bit more about the competing imaginaries as you see them, and whether analytically you would put the differences in both ontology and normativity and how those fit together, perhaps, but maybe just take a little bit more time to say, you know, how you found the imaginaries concept helpful to analyzing the ways in which different positions are taken up in your Petrofutures project.
Thank you for your question. I'm not sure how to.
Well, I mean, I think, you know, just descriptively take a little bit more time to say something about what you see as the imaginaries that are at play here. Is it fundamentally? I mean, so I was taken with even the term Petrofutures because there's a materiality to it, and
yes.
I mean, so the material temporal packaging is interesting.
Yes.
And you know how that plays into how people are positioning themselves vis-a-vis these futures is obviously quite interesting to know, and how future is the future. You know, so I mean, just a little bit more description even might be helpful to all of us as your audience.
Yeah. Well, maybe I have to say at this point that this is still an ongoing study, and I'm still trying to figure out whether this way of conceptualizing the phenomenon is relevant.
But you're noticing something that makes you latch onto this idea of imaginary. So I guess I'm just asking you to allow us to walk with you through your material and sort of see, you know, what is sparking your interest in this. I mean, so Emil was very clear about localizing his case, and Hrepner also about the particular concrete examples. And I'm wondering whether you were triggered by a similar sort of moment or a document or a proceeding, or, you know, just sort of where you situated yourself as you... I mean, this is a masterclass, so it's also a kind of research exercise. How do you recognize a question when you see it? It's something we spend a lot of time trying to teach our students. How do you know that a research question is marching down the road at you?
Well, maybe, well, what I'm trying to do in this project is that to explore how these ideas that actors in the context of the Cold War were influenced by the existing contexts that had been formulated over quite a long time period.
And you conceived this project before February of this year? Or is that not true? I mean, you were thinking about a set of questions that have become very immediate all of a sudden, right? So it'll be interesting to see how you carry your historical research forward and in the context of the present. I was wondering, to come back to my right hand in a sense, I mean, so, or to any of you, if you have a particular question that you would like to push forward more, and it can be selfish in connection with some very particular thing you are trying to solve, don't make it so general as, do imaginaries apply to my work? I mean, but a little bit more specific than that. If you want to walk off this stage with one thing to which you have an answer that you didn't have before, what would such a question be?
I would very much like to take the opportunity to ask a selfish question. Let me consult my notes just not to miss something. I think it's maybe a group of questions that boil down to socio-technical imaginaries as a theoretical concept versus an analytical one. So when I'm still in the process of modeling my thesis, I stumble across other researchers who have used it in a way that resembles definitely an analytical tool more than just a theoretical concept. So having an opportunity to ask a question directly to the person who came up with the concept, do you see it as an analytical tool as well? And if so, can it be both things, and how?
Yeah, so you may have to educate me first, because I'm not sure what the difference between theoretical and analytical is. I mean, if it is the difference between description and generalization in some sense that you're trying to get at, I think that people who use the concept most often go wrong because, if they do go wrong, because they don't understand fully that it has a historical trajectory of its own. I mean, so as a historian of ideas, you will understand that ideas don't just come, into being out of nowhere. So in the case of socio-technical imaginaries, it's very much embedded in the comparative work that I've done for a long time. That is, when people meet up against technological choices, why do groups of different sorts, whether they're nation states or members of social movements or whatever, not go in the same direction? To some extent it was buried in, or it was in front of Emil's question about whether surveillance capitalism versus GDPR reflect different political and social trajectories on the two sides of the Atlantic. So I think that set of questions, what gives continuity to ways of organizing the world that are repeated over and over again? I mean, given a choice, why does American policy tend to end up favoring something that it regards as market, whereas on the European side there's more of an embrace of collective solutions, call it the state or call it whatever? That kind of thinking led to this imaginaries work, right? I mean, so it is theorizing in the sense that one can posit that if one sees, like a sharp break in a trajectory that a society has been following, taking the imaginaries framework might point you in the direction of some explanatory choices that you might be making, and that what is it that changed in the collective imagination? Was it even a change, or was it the fact that there were inchoate things that became crystallized in certain ways? So let's take something that's extremely well known, scientific revolutions, right? Everybody knows Thomas Kuhn, everybody knows that he had an explanation for what makes scientific revolutions happen. In the Kuhnian account, it's very internalist. It's like scientists are doing their work and they meet up against anomalies, observations that, I mean, if you want to call this analytical, that escape analysis. Mostly they chuck it into a bin and they don't think about it, but then the bin gradually gets fuller and fuller and the anomalies begin to swallow up the universe of possibility, and then you get a scientific revolution that alters things. Well, what's very interesting about that explanation of a scientific revolution is the failure to put the science back into any wider social context at all. It's like nothing happened other than the anomalies became more and more. It doesn't even consider that new instrumentation might change the way the world was looking to you. So, for instance, that telescopes getting better and better might have given you a different purchase on the heavens, so that, at some point, Ptolemy became old hat and you had to put on Copernicus as your new hat. I mean, it's like nothing changed in society. And I think that the entire co-productionist approach says, be very wary of locating your explanatory energy and fervor in, one place, which is internal to the nature of the science or the nature of the ideas, that the forces may be coming from elsewhere. And so, for instance, a way of pushing the human imprint on Earth back and theorizing it as part of a very long process, once you've invented the Anthropocene as a conceptual category in your history of ideas, for instance, then the potential for rethinking climate change as part of this much longer ongoing process begins to look different. Suddenly the questions of who is responsible, the fact that we're operating as a single species, humanity, I mean, these things become visible. So I think that for me, partly rather than dwell in a philosophically, almost a scholastic way on whether analysis and theory are different things, what's more important to me is, does the conceptual reordering of the world through the invention of new conceptual ideas, which are themselves generalizations of a certain sort, does that cause you to look at the world differently, sort of see things that are now set in motion that you took for granted before? It's like putting on the 3D glasses in a 2D world and finding depth of field and things, in relational configurations in relation to one another. And I think that in interpretive social science, that's what theorizing concepts do for you. They offer you a new purchase. They allow you to be attentive to other kinds of things that you might not have noticed before because they were backgrounded in the kind of reality space that you were moving around in. So I think that's more the way that I think of these ideas.
It's a very good answer, thank you.
Mm-hmm. In the same spirit, can I ask a question?
Absolutely.
Okay, I think, well, I took the opportunity because I think maybe it's somewhat related, because it's also of an analytical nature. But it was firstly sparked by I'm not going to go through them, but the readings by Bruno Latour for today, and it's not necessary to remember all the points. But then I thought of it again during Emil's presentation, and what I want to ask is, what has been a key, I would say, effort for STS for decades in many ways, and related fields is, of course, to sort of break down some distinctions that have been too hardwired and that have somehow hindered us scholars in seeing the hybridity and the assemblages and the connections. And I completely applaud that effort, and I think it's of the utmost importance. What I want to ask is, I did sort of begin think a little bit whether sometimes it also can be taken a bit too far. What I focused on when reading Latour, he was bringing up, and just to exemplify through him, he was bringing up the issue that today's environmental battles or advocacy sometimes has the approach that people want to fight for phenomena of rewilding, phenomena of making spaces for nature where humans get back. And of course, his issue with that was that it's an illusion that we can even create these spaces, and of course, humans will always have some significant part in shaping them. But he, of course, has an both analytical and theoretical point to make in that it is an illusion to create these pure spaces, and they, of course, have ideological and historical issues, the idea that we can do that. What I want to ask, and the same goes for the ideas of global and local, these two concepts, and the concepts of nature as something separate from humans. These concepts and these analytical ideas that we can sort of separate, at least in some contexts. I agree that the most important effort would be to sort of subvert them, but I do also want to sort of ask you if there could be also a point in preserving them in some contexts for strategic purposes. I mean, national parks, when done in a correct way, do actually take out humans and do some work towards decentering the human utility, the human extractivist way of using nature. So could there be something to be said for preserving these concepts and even the distinctions between them, while being extremely mindful of when and how and why we do it?
Yeah. No, I'm really glad you asked that question, because it points to nuanced differences between schools of thought inside of STS. And in a way, STS is a thriving discipline because it does play host to different highly developed schools of thought that to some extent play off of one another and yet are not the same. So I think that it's interesting to criticize movements like rewilding by saying, well, there's no such thing as wild anyway, and we're always already there. But it's a little bit hubristic to say that we, as scholars, have some say in whether a concept is going to be kept alive in the world or not. I mean, the fact is, if people are using it, they're using it for some purposes of their own, and I think it behooves us as modest witnesses, to take a different phrase from a different author, in the world, to say, well, more like, what is it that people are thinking about? And, most of these categories that we use all the time, like democracy, it's not because they are useful or useless or have meaning or don't have meaning. It's that they are, to some degree, aspirational toward ways in which people think that they ought to be living. Now, is there going to be a time when people do not separate self and other? I doubt it. It's supposed to be a sort of, criterion of greater maturation, that you learn to separate self and other. People who have never learned to separate self from other are said to be suffering from various psychic ailments. In that sense, it's in a way almost a moot question whether you're going to say, genetically we're the same as other species and therefore there's no difference. It's not that. It's what we use our powers of imagination and organization to do for ourselves in the world. And it's better to, the interesting STS analytic move is not to say, is this or isn't this? After all, that is precisely the distinction STS has been breaking apart. So why should Latour, in his maturity, get so excited about whether the wilderness exists or doesn't exist? Isn't it much more interesting to say, when is it invoked? For what purpose? Is it serving rich people to save their backyards from becoming populated by the housing of the poor? Or is it a part of nation building that says we as a polity, as a collective, earn a kind of collective spiritual grace by saying that we will preserve these places as not fully subject to every kind of depredation that we could place upon them? Is that not a kind of modern sacrality that could bind people together? And is it an answer to that to say, well, but there really isn't nature? It isn't. That's not the point. The point is, if we didn't have nature, we'd be inventing it. So therefore, what are we inventing and why? And who is involved in that in a participatory way? Who gets to, do we take certain viewpoints like, your Indian shloka or your indigeneity and exoticize them and say, we'll invite them to the table and look, aren't we great because we invited them to the table? But we won't take the full implications of a radically different ontological ordering into view when we ultimately decide how things are going to be. That is, we will create a carbon market at the end of the day and say carbon is carbon is carbon, and not carbon that you did by depredations on the world should be different carbon from the carbon of a more naturalized living in the world. So I think that the difference between the co-productionist line of thought, which also has imaginaries embedded in it, and this other mode of STS that gives a lot of reality to the material, is in that. For me, the essentialist question, is this or isn't this, is never the right question. Never say never. But anyway, it's not usually the interesting question. The interesting question is, why have we ordered the is and the ought in the ways that we've ordered them? And, would it be a different world and possibly a better world if we drew the is-ought boundaries in different ways? But for heaven's sake, give me a world in which there is no is and no ought. I don't want to be in that world. It would be horribly dislocating.
Can I follow up on this quickly? Because I noticed you saying, what am I inventing and why, or what are we inventing and why? And if we think about, or if I put this in context into your chapter in a constitutional moment, when you're talking about how we need technologies to make their goals and more explicit. I wonder if we are trying to move from this nation locking us into a country-specific developments and trying to lift it up and have a helicopter view of how we move then forward. where should the agency be? Who should have it? How can we unlearn the bad habits of the past and take with us the good ones?
Well, I mean, that's, of course, pointed and very deep questions. Where should the agency be is the easier thing to address, because in a sense, everywhere. I mean, I see one of the things that STS does as a field as a project of unlocking. That is, we've grown so used to living in modernity that we think that certain doors are closed and should not be opened. Now, we're all, to some degree, familiar with fairy tales like Bluebeard, where you're told, especially the woman is told not to unlock certain doors because woe betide that the woman should find the knowledge that is behind that door. But in any case, opening doors is not always the best thing. You know, the breaching experiment was a good indication that sometimes a door should be just a door. But nonetheless, I think an analytic approach that says do not take very established orders of the world entirely for granted. That is, I think, an empowering thing, because it makes you develop a kind of self-taught X-ray vision look at the world, so that you see black wall there, but behind it there are joints and you can do things. My own project of discipline making has been a little bit of an exercise like that. I mean, I think you talked about how some disciplines seem to become more coherent, whereas others dissipate in some sense. But I think that if you're trying to put together a new way of looking at the world, STS tools are extremely useful in helping you see how the solidity got constructed in the first place, and therefore where you can begin to insert yourself as not a part of that solidity. Now you can ride on the coattails, so to some extent all the work on ethics of science and responsibility in science to some extent is piggybacking on the role of the sciences, that everybody wants the science to develop. They want somebody to serve as their moral conscience, and so the STS player steps forward and says, I will do the ethics of this technology and that technology, and you get nanoethics and neuroethics and bioethics and God knows what else ethics, and you know, and then you become a kind of adjunct to the already constructed places of the world, and that's not necessarily the most effective way of using your agency if you want to reconfigure certain things. But there's no prescription, you know that. You know, you can't tell people, follow, you know, my recipe in these nice 10 steps, and then you'll be home free and you'll have a world that's reorganized the way you want it. I think at most you can teach habits of critical thought. You can say, do not take the black boxes for granted. See how they came into being. History is profoundly important there because you can trace the steps, and history is itself an unlocking device. I mean, as an area of study, it tells you, because at any given moment, the archive will tell you that it could have been this other way, but somehow it didn't get to be that way, and why not often gives you a key to the lock to some extent. Things are buried. I mean, this is why, you know, the current American sharp debate about Roe v. Wade, the abortion decision, and my liberal colleagues and friends are all hand-wringing over the turning back of this, you know, 50-year right that has been granted to women. And of course it's shocking. Of course it's shocking that the politics of the Supreme Court allows a radical change of this sort to happen without the entire population taking to the streets. I mean, if you think about it as a kind of coup, it's astonishing that the American people, by and large, are passively putting up with the coup, right? I mean, so that would be the pessimistic way of looking at it. But is there something else to be found? I mean, you know, for one thing, one can try to understand how a decision loses its power. It's because the other guys were maybe the better sociologists of knowledge. And they understood the chinks and the fissures into which they could insert their ideas and build a new regime. And one of them is assert your revolutionary fervor to grab the court, which they did. But they were accusing the progressive side of having done precisely that same move in the generation before that. So, you know, the slogan, "Take Back the Night," which has accompanied women's movements for a long time now. I mean, I think if we think of STS as a field that I sometimes refer to as the field of the Second Enlightenment, it's taking back the night from the First Enlightenment, which has led us to think in certain kinds of ways that are too habituated and comfortable, you know, a sort of eternal progressivism, and science always advances and technology always improves. And, you know, I think agency means not buying into those myths, but being alert and alive to possibility. But then it also requires a sort of profound reinterrogation of one's own ethics, right? I mean, that is, what is it we believe? I mean, not all mobilization is necessarily for the good, but that is a choice that people have to make for themselves. What STS does is say that if you are an ethical being in the world and are armed with the tools of constructivism, which include imaginaries, and you have an analytic way of parsing the imaginary underlying the developments, then you have a set of ways forward. They're not going to be easy necessarily at all, but at least it's a way forward. And as we know from the great story of the promised land, that the person who imagines it may not live to see it, but it doesn't mean that the land isn't there. And it doesn't even have to be real land, it's the promise.
Mm-hmm.
So, can I ask a question? I was wondering if you could just explain the choice of words socio-technical. And part of the reason is selfish, I guess, that I'm asking, because I don't know as much as I'd like about the sort of origins of SDS in Cambridge, among other places. But what I see when you look at these engineers in the 60s is that this kind of very it's not necessarily determinist, but the very technologically driven conception of what's the driver of history, what's the driver of society, is very central, and it also becomes the means through which the field of engineering itself is expanded to include more abstract processes, systems, and even this kind of quixotic project in socio-technological engineering. And I know that some of those early characters in Cambridge, at least, were very interested in the kind of successes of post-war technocrats that were there, and some of those conversations that were going around. And I just noticed the kind of David Noble was part of our readings. He was talking a lot about the importance of capitalism and engineering and science in America, and also Hans Jonas's Heideggerian technology forward philosophy, and like. So are those things connected at all? And if so, what does that mean in terms of the kind of historical and geographical scope of a socio-technical imaginary?
Well, let's take the easy part of the question first. Why socio-technical? It's partly because imaginaries have been thought about in numerous fields, including anthropology and political theory. And Charles Taylor, for instance, is credited with thinking about the social imaginary as a grand coalition of ideas that dominate in certain periods and eventually give way. And of course, Ben Anderson's extremely famous book title, Imagined Communities, is also about a kind of imagination that affects the social, it affects or relates to the ways in which we organize ourselves. But STS, of course, at its core has said, you know, do not think human-to-human interactions as the be-all and end-all, that there is also technology in there, or the material side of scientific discoveries. And so socio-technical is a way of saying that in today's world, if you want to use imaginaries as any kind of concept, analytic or otherwise, you cannot leave the force of the technologies we've made out. So sociotechnical is a way of enlarging the scope of the imaginary to include the material manifestations of our world, in a sense. The second thing you're asking is something that I hope you will continue to work with, because it's a seriously interesting question. Why the thinking of the mid-century that was much more receptive to grand structural questions, by and large in America has sort of disappeared. I mean, David Noble marked a certain kind of moment in the development of STS at MIT that failed precisely when he was not granted tenure, and there was another such moment later on involving a different scholar who was also not granted tenure. Not granting tenure is a way of saying this trajectory, it's like pruning a tree. It happened in Harvard economics at a certain time. And so, you know, it would be, and by the way, it's all the structuralists that get pruned out. I mean, so, you know, so, you know, it's capital, it's, to some degree, it's feminism as well. These become dangerous ideas because they're suggesting that, hey, you know, power isn't all located in the person making the individual preferential choices and then the anonymous hand of the market just aggregating these innocent choices, right? I mean, you know, so, you know, why is MIT not the place where the more power-oriented STS is thriving? Why is it at Harvard? You know, that's an interesting question because MIT, you know, many people say belly of the beast within sort of 3 seconds of starting to talk about MIT, but it's like it extrudes its own self-reflective capacity, which in turn may be a sort of property of the way critique works in America. But I think that if your project goes into understanding those phenomena in more detail, using the moments that you've chosen and the work that you've chosen on climate as an entry point, that would be fascinating. And I look forward to seeing much more of it. So I see the seconds ticking on, and I'm wondering whether you want to.
I should go onto the stage, I guess. Thank you very much for a very interesting discussion. You have certainly, all of you, unlocked a lot of questions in my head. There were lots of questions there from before, but now I have even more questions, which is a good thing. We now open the floor for a Q&A session. We have a volunteer over here with a microphone, so please raise your hands if you like to ask anything, or if you have any comments or queries. You can also think about this for a bit. I have a comment or a question to all of you while the audience thinks, and that is the notion of the future that you all allude to, which made me think about the pluralization of time, of temporality, which has, of course, been long-standing in a lot of philosophy, in a lot of social science, but there are now also calls to undo a bit of our thinking about time, that we need to move away from thinking about time in terms of linearity, in terms of multiple trajectories of time and moving forward in a linear way, and that we need to consider recursivity in a sense. Yeah. So I was wondering if any of you would like to comment on that, since you work with the future in a sense.
Well, I think we should give our young scholars a chance to jump in first, and then obviously I'm prepared to say things.
I think if I can just, I can only speak for my own project and my own approach, but I think the way that and what I tried to relay in my presentation was, to state it a bit bluntly, or a little bit sharply, was a rupture in what I would call an overarching socio-technical imaginary as indigenous knowledges are brought in. And why I think that the future, in that sense, comes into the topic, is because the rupture itself, if one would call it that, it's very minor, does hold some promise for a future with a more pluralized notion of expertise. And it does also actually point to what you were saying there with another temporal notion, because that's what I sort of tried to say, that when indigenous peoples come to the table, they also bring other ontological commitments and also other temporal commitments and ways of visualizing and futurizing. So I think that if I am correct in saying that that is one smaller development, you could absolutely say that the linearity is challenged in future imaginaries of climate.
Yeah. I would say that I think the big problem of some popular imaginations about time have more to do with the idea of universal time than about linear time. And I think oftentimes you have these critiques that are like, well, I guess they need to be circular then, which is kind of neither here nor there for me. A lot of what we study in the Lifetimes Project, which is a project about multiple temporalities, is to both look at the ways that shared temporal frames are created and the importance of kind of digging out the very particular ways that time is engaged in different knowledge practices in particular.
I absolutely agree. Were you going to say something?
No, go ahead.
I was going to ask a question, actually, whether linearity of time influences the concept of future, because that seemed to be an underlying assumption, and I don't see it as such. I think delinearization of time is something that we as Westerners need to do for our own benefit, not for the sake of the concept of future itself.
Well, I mean, it's interesting that, Hana, you bring us to the prescriptive question that is, again, is it important to resolve whether time is linear or not, or instead ask in what context does it operate as if linear? If you are a worker tied to a time card, it's going to be linear for you whether you like it or not, and you might want to unionize to get out of that. But that's not, where does it matter? So obviously it matters in these progress narratives that we've been told about science and technology, right? That where linearity serves a purpose, it serves a justifying purpose that, of course, we should go our merry way the way we've done it, because, look, we're living longer, we're eating better, all the stories, we're dying less, and so forth. And then for historians, there's a real question how, when the shock happens and the linearity narrative is disrupted, nevertheless people like Elastic go back to the linear narrative as if the shock never happened in some sense. Except for the people who suffered from the shock, and they're not the ones with the agency, right? So we're still reaping the consequences of certainly the 2008 financial crisis, but it's as if the markets have forgotten all about it, and the economy or economies rebounded, except maybe something happened to supply chains, and now it's always the linear narrative that's maintained as if it's the right one, and then you explain the other things as exceptional. So it's the work that the linear narrative does. So a first comeback in a kind of STS methodological sense is, I think, Ritmo, the point you were making, that after all, people in the world are operating with very different temporalities. And you can ask, who has the luxury to imagine time 100 years hence as opposed to time tomorrow. And people whose main concern is subsistence do not have that. It's a question, will you live from one day to the next? Will your child live when you don't have access to healthcare? So to some degree, temporalities in the world are already configured for people and configured in accordance with lines of power in certain ways. So even, I mean, to some extent, the debate about linearity, non-linearity almost seems a cop-out, you know, when you're seeing that for some people, or many people, it has to be linear in that sense when you're going from, you know, 24-hour period to 24-hour period, and your worry is whether there will be food to eat at the end of that time, or a house over your head. So I think that I would like to say that STS's first destabilization is the destabilization that says there never was a single coherent narrative of time in people's lives anyway. A second destabilization is to say normatively, therefore, any choice of a singular narrative is an exercise of power in a certain sense. And then thirdly, if you want to take STS into being a source of critique, then, you know, what other narratives would be more consistent with one's theories of justice? And that, I think, is a deep next step.
Thank you very much. We have one question from the audience. If you can be brief, that would be great, because we don't have that many minutes left. Thank you.
I want to ask actually about time and STS, because I think, Sheila, in one of your acceptance of the Holberg Prize statements, I think you used Thomas Paine's quote, "The times have found us." And this idea of the times have found us, and the idea that, you know, right now is the time for STS, and it resonates with so many aspects of the world, both kind of the indigenous knowledge, the centrality of feminism, again, you know, the perception that we are all fighting colonialism, and even in Russia-Ukraine conflict, etc. I wonder, do you feel like this is a certain moment for STS? And I want to ask that to the panelists who are using STS and are growing into the field of STS and thinking of your own future in its term. Do you feel empowered by STS? And for Sheila, if you have a time to answer this, do you feel like this is a particular moment in the history of STS to work as an STS scholar?
Well, I think you were generous enough to ask the panelists, and I mean, do you feel empowered by STS? But I would add, and if so, how? Maybe we can take a very quick swing through.
I think STS has very complicated tradition that can also be a little bit confusing at first. So maybe empowered is not something, it's not that is its drawing force perhaps, but absolutely there is something in the moment that makes it attractive, that makes it very difficult to not engage with. That was my experience, at least. But I would be very interesting to hear you answer that question, because you touched upon it in our conversation before the panel.
Yeah, absolutely. I can comment on this, because I think for creative solutions for the future, we want to be able to break down the silos that we have constructed in the past. And as a traditionally trained lawyer, I don't foresee how we can move with the great consensus that we want to have when we regulate, without using the aspects that STS allows us to illuminate the dark corners, the imaginaries that we are brought up with, that we're told that we're taught, and break them down and construct them together for the future. And I think also that this plays into the time narrative, because if we are, like with the examples before that I was taking, like we can talk about increased risk of breast cancer, and we can talk about avalanche. One is a rapid disaster, onset disaster, and another one is something that happens slowly over time, potentially. And this narrative also has to be looked at and perceived from an STS perspective in order to see the difference.
Very good. We have time for 30-second interventions, and then we have to wrap up. I'm sorry.
Okay, I'll have to do the brief version then. I think I feel empowered by co-productionist thinking to the extent that I just think it makes analytical sense. In my neck of the woods, there's constant talk about history swept back all over the place, and I think there's something to be said about that as well, but certainly.
Yes, well, I feel empowered by this STS approach, as it provides a lens to explore the different kinds of futures we can make collectively. Thank you.
And I'm also I feel very empowered. I agree very much with Sheila Jasanoff and the intellectual humility. But I also do think that the analytics that we are provided with STS do give us an insight into distributions of agency in places where we didn't find them before, and that also makes us empowered to actually point out to where we can go to find new agencies and cultivate them. Yeah.
Thank you very much. We've spent 2 hours, and 2 hours was not enough. We could have continued for a very long time. But in closing, I want to thank the Holberg Laureate Sheila Jasanoff, as well as the 5 PhD students for providing us with fresh, original, and thought-provoking contributions. Thank you all for making this a most exciting masterclass. I also want to thank the audience who has joined us here, visibly, noisily, presently at the Media City Bergen. We're very happy about that. Now, the program for today here has ended, but we have a range of other events lined up for you this week with the Holberg Symposium and the Holberg Lecture tomorrow at the University Åla. But before that, there is the event An Evening with the Holberg Prize at 6 o'clock this evening at the House of Literature here in Bergen. This will feature the Holberg Prize Laureate Sheila Jasanoff and the Nils Klim Prize Laureate Elisa Usimäki in a conversation about their background, their research, and their experience from academia. Moderator for the conversation is Roger Strand, professor at the Center for the Study of Sciences and the Humanities, University of Bergen. Welcome back then, as well as welcome back tomorrow. Thank you all.